So today we'll be talking about Chapter 7, Section 3. And the title of this is The Age of Jackson. Andrew Jackson it is we're going to be talking about. And as president, the policies that he implemented in some ways represent the common person. In fact, you could argue that Andrew Jackson was the first populist president. And we'll talk about what populism means in a little bit. But he liked to be seen as a man of the people, though in fact he was extremely wealthy and owned lots of slaves. So Andrew Jackson is a very controversial figure. I'll be honest, my personal bias, I can't stand this guy for reasons that you'll see hopefully in a moment. Number one, he's the one who kicked the Native Americans out of the Southeast, and I just think that's very unfair. Violated Native American rights severely, even though the Supreme Court tried to stop him. And again, we'll look at him. But a rather controversial figure in American history, Andrew Jackson. Now first, let's talk about an election. Because after all, we've got a big election coming up, right? In 1824, Andrew Jackson won the popular vote. However, he lost the electoral vote. And you know, this is one of the troubles with the electoral college system, that since elections are determined state by state through the electoral college, this situation can occur from time to time. This election was rather nasty. Like the Adams-Jefferson debates, they were calling each other all sorts of things. Now, John Quincy Adams, meanwhile, was elected president by the House of Representatives with Henry Clay's support. So, in regards to a close electoral college vote, remember it is the electoral college that ultimately determines the president. Now, supporters of Jackson claimed that the election was rigged because he lost, right? So Jackson supporters not only threatened to claim it was rigged, they actually began to call it rigged and called it a corrupt bargain, that Adams had not actually won the presidency by all fairness, but had stolen it. Now, Jacksonians formed the Democratic-Republican Party. And the purpose of this party was to block and obstruct anything that John Quincy Adams tried to do as president. So you think the troubles and drama that we have in our own political system are new? Certainly not. In fact, this whole purpose of this entire party, when it began, was to obstruct John Quincy Adams from getting anything done. And then the election came up again, 1828. And again, Andrew Jackson ran for president. However, between 1824 and 1828, most states had eased voting restrictions, now allowing non-property owning whites to vote. Non-property owning. So now poor white males could vote as well. And Jackson had the poor white male vote. And he won quite soundedly presidency of the United States in 1828.
In the 1828 election, by avoiding a stand on major issues, Jackson was able to win the support of many different interest groups throughout the country. To the new laboring classes in the East, he appeared to be an advocate of the working man. To small capitalists, he represented an opportunity to compete with big capitalists. Southerners identified with him as a plantation owner, while Westerners saw him as their own frontier hero. Jackson also appealed to the new nationalism that was sweeping America. As a self-made man who had built the Hermitage from a shack into a mansion, as a military leader who defended the people against Indians and Englishmen, and as a man who, born in a log cabin, could be a champion of the people as President of the United States. Faithful to his friends and suspicious of rivals, Jackson began to hand out political appointments as soon as he took office. Office holders from the previous administration were replaced by loyal party workers in what has come to be known as the spoils system. While Jackson did not invent the idea of political patronage, it had been used on the state level for many years, Jackson did introduce the practice in the national government. Previous cabinets had included nonpartisan experts in their fields. Jackson made his cabinet appointments with seeming disregard for background or experience, the main requirement being personal loyalty to Jackson. Members of the press were included in the cabinet for the first time. Amos Kendall, editor of the Kentucky Argus, was made Postmaster General. And another new tradition was established. Jackson surrounded himself with a group of non-elected, unofficial, but influential advisors who came to be known as the Kitchen Cabinet. Howls of disapproval were voiced in the opposition press, with Jackson depicted as the evil manipulator of a set of greedy puppets. In actuality, however, the new president replaced only about 9% of all civil servants, no more than Jefferson had done before him. Jackson called this policy rotation in office and saw it as a means of weeding out corruption. While his enemies made fun of rats deserting a toppling house, Jackson was glad to get rid of undesirables, as frauds and misuse of public funds to the amount of $280,000 were uncovered in the Treasury Department alone. When Jackson took office, sectional interests divided the country. New England was symbolized by a turtle because it surrounded itself by the shell of high tariffs, and the West was seen as a tough-skinned alligator, ready to swallow up anything in sight. But Jackson saw himself as the only person elected by the whole nation, and maintained that it was his duty to represent all interests equally.
Now, Andrew Jackson was immensely popular with the poor white vote. He claimed that he was from humble origins, said that he had grown up in a log cabin, that he was a self-made man, that he had built his mansion by his own means. And he lived in Tennessee, in fact, not far from Nashville. In reality, he was very wealthy. Yet, he wanted to be seen as the champion of the common man, even though he was really a one-percenter. And he painted or depicted his rival, John Quincy Adams, as an intellectual elitist, one of these uppity college types that came from a silver spoon. But Jackson wanted to be seen as this man of the people. And Jackson won with the help of the poor white vote, in a landslide, in fact. Now, as president, he may be the only president that I'm aware of that invited whoever wanted to come to the White House to have a big keg party and sleep on the couches. True story. That was his inauguration day. Threw a big keg party at the White House. Everybody crashed on the couches. In fact, supposedly they had to actually kick people out the next day. Now, when he came to the White House to serve, he did actually kick out most of the other advisors. And this set the precedent of a president picking their advisors. That's called the spoils system, where former appointees to the executive office could be replaced with anybody the president so chooses. Now, Jackson did pick his formal cabinet, just like Washington had, just like Adams had, just like those before him had. However, he also had this informal cabinet that was nicknamed the Kitchen Cabinet, because formal cabinet positions do have to be confirmed by the Senate. But then Jackson also surrounded himself with his friends, who became very influential within his administration. And they were nicknamed the Kitchen Cabinet, these informal advisors that had a great deal of influence on the president. But here's Andrew Jackson on his way to his inauguration in 1829. Now, perhaps the most controversial action of Andrew Jackson's tenure was the Indian Removal Act of 1830. White Americans wanted to displace Native Americans, wanted their land, wanted Native Americans to behave like white Americans. They wanted them to assimilate. Many white Americans began to complain that assimilation or displacement would never occur without the use of force. Jackson believed the only solution was to move Native Americans off their land. He felt that assimilation could not work, that it was not feasible. He felt, and this was his excuse, that, we would just need too many troops to keep peace and to keep whites out of Native American land, so let's just make the Native Americans leave. And so Jackson pressured Congress to pass the controversial Indian Removal Act of 1830, and this would provide funds and treaties that would force Native American peoples to move west. And if you spend any time in the mountains of Western Carolina, then you know that we are on Native American soil. And as you go further in the mountains, you realize that you begin to even see writings in Cherokee. If you go way up in the Snowbird Mountains, past Robbinsville, you'll see the language of Qualla, the Cherokee written language, on road signs. If you go up 441, the Foothills Parkway, way up towards Newfound Gap in the Great Smoky Mountains, you'll pass by the Raven Fork Gorge. The Snowbird Mountains and the Santila and the Raven Fork Gorge were two of the most remote places in the southeastern United States at this time, and that's where people, innocent men, women, and children, hid to escape the federal government that was sent to run these people off their land. And they hid. And they hid because it's some of the roughest country in the southeastern United States. And I've spent time in these places. It's inhospitable, steep. Winters can be tough because the elevation is rather high. Spent time there in January, nearly froze to death this past January up in these very mountains that these Native American peoples hid from the federal government. Gotten lost in these woods because it's difficult terrain. These places that people hid for their very lives from the United States government. Some tribes had to be forcibly removed. Some tribes did honor the treaty. The Cherokee actually fought this in court, and we'll discuss that more in just a moment. For now, I just want to show you briefly where these people are coming from. Now, of course, the Cherokee are the ones closest to home, and you can drive an hour down the road and go to the town of Cherokee because the eastern band of the Cherokee did successfully hide in the Raven Fork Gorge, just up the Econolophy from Big Creek Road, where Cherokee High School is today. Again, one of the most rugged and rough places in the southeast. So some of them did hide, yes. And then again, there is another community in the Snowbird Mountains, and there's another community on the far western part of North Carolina near Murphy. And these places are now considered Cherokee reservations. But most Cherokee people reside in the western band of the Cherokee in Oklahoma because they were forced to leave from their homes. I grew up in Coker Creek, Tennessee, named after a Cherokee princess, Betsy Coker, one of the last Cherokee princesses to be born in my hometown. As I'm sure you guys can find artifacts, if you dig around the mountains enough, you'll find Cherokee artifacts. Well, the Cherokee weren't the only tribe. You have the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, Seminole, as well as many others. And I just put others because we have tribes here coming from the Northeast, the Northwest, all throughout the United States. But you're going to hear the most about these 5 tribes that I've just named because they were called the, quote, civilized tribes. And I'll tell you why in just a moment.
One of the first big challenges Andrew Jackson faced as president concerned the rights of American Indians. Back then, pressure from white settlers and real estate speculators had led the states of Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi to seize Native American farmlands. And even though these actions clearly violated federal treaties, President Jackson did nothing to stop them. On the contrary, in 1830, he helped push the Indian Removal Act through Congress. The Indian Removal Act required 5 eastern tribes, the Cherokee, the Creek, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, and the Seminole, to abandon their farms and move far to the west to what was called the Indian Territory, which is now in the state of Oklahoma. When the Cherokees appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, the court affirmed that the seizure of Indian lands by the states was illegal. Nevertheless, the tribes were forced off their lands anyway. All the tribes suffered enormously due to the Indian Removal Act, but for the Cherokees, things were especially bad. U.S. troops rounded up 15,000 Cherokee men, women, and children and put them in military stockades. Then, under armed guard, the Cherokees were marched off to the Indian Territory, a distance of some 1,200 miles, or 2,000 kilometers. This event has come to be called the Trail of Tears, because when it was over, 4,000 Cherokees had died of starvation and disease. Ironically, White Path, the Cherokee warrior chief buried here on the Trail of Tears, was once awarded a medal for helping Andrew Jackson during a dangerous battle.
Now, I wanted to tell you briefly about these, quote, 5 civilized tribes. Some tribes, like the Shawnee, decided that white man's culture was not for them. They wanted to maintain their traditions and their ways. As we would move further west and come into contact with groups like the Apache and the Sioux, we would also find that same resistance to assimilation. Just like you would resist if someone tried to force you to change your culture and your way of life. Can you imagine if someone tried to talk to you about your religion or your faith and then called you a pagan and a savage because of your beliefs, and then attempted to force you to change those beliefs, and then would use your unwillingness to change your beliefs as grounds for kicking you out of your home and running you out of town? That's exactly what many Native American tribes encountered, and that's exactly how we treated many. But not these, quote, 5 civilized tribes. These people agreed they would do everything they could to assimilate with the white man. They encouraged their women to marry white men. They expected one another to begin to build homes and live in towns and communities. They adopted democracy. They learned English. They dressed just like white men. In fact, by the time the Indian Removal Act was passed in 1830, many Cherokee men and women contained mixed ethnicity. And that's why if I were to ask you, I bet many of you have mixed Cherokee blood or other Native American ethnicity within your ancestry. Because these people chose to intermarry, chose to assimilate their customs. If you go to the town of Cherokee, most of the signs are bilingual because within the past few years, within your lifetime, the Cherokee have tried to revitalize much of their culture and began to, Western Carolina teaches Cherokee studies. You can go and learn the Cherokee language at Western Carolina University. But it's just very sad. You see, again, I grew up closely around the Cherokee. A lot of folks in my community, just like a lot of yours, have Cherokee blood. I grew up right near the birthplace of Sequoyah. He was the man who developed the Cherokee written language. I grew up and passed by the Trail of Tears every day on my way to high school. And I could find artifacts in my home. I have arrowheads I've dug up from my own home place. And this is a famous painting of the Cherokee being forced to leave. I keep mentioning the Cherokee because they popped up from time to time. They had taken this idea of assimilating to a whole new level. They had even sent many of their best and brightest off to American universities. They had lawyers among their community. They had doctors. They had trained politicians. And they took the case of the Indian Removal Act to the United States Supreme Court. And they won in the famous case of Worcester versus Georgia. The United States Supreme Court ruled that a state, that is the state of Georgia where they contested this, cannot force the Cherokee off of their land. Legally, this should have been the end of it. Because the Supreme Court interpreted the Constitution, it wouldn't take a rocket scientist to say, oh, you can't steal someone's land or force them off of it. And that should have been the end of it. Because we've seen in McCulloch versus Maryland, we've seen in Marbury versus Madison, where the Supreme Court has told both the states and even the president before, no. And they've had to listen. But in this case, and they started calling him King Andrew for this, Andrew Jackson refused to enforce the ruling of a Supreme Court justice. Some Cherokee tried to continue the fight in court because the law was on their side at this point. In fact, Jackson was acting illegally when he sent troops to force them off their land. Yet a small minority of the Cherokee understood that fighting this in court was futile, that the will of the people were against them, and began to relocate. In fact, by 1838, relocation had begun. Only 20,000 Cherokee people had remained. And subsequent president, Martin Van Buren, who had been endorsed by Jackson, also ordered the removal of these final peoples. The Cherokee were sent west on the Trail of Tears. Some tribes had to walk up to 1,200 miles. For most Cherokee peoples living west of the Appalachians, this was roughly 800 miles. If you looked at the trail on the map that we saw just a moment ago, you'll see it again on your test. The trail went north through the Wilderness Road and then west across the plains of Tennessee through Kentucky into Oklahoma, crossing the Mississippi. Thousands died, men, women, and children forced to walk this great distance, mostly on foot, under the escort of armed guards. Now, you heard me mention Sequoia. This is a common field trip when I was a kid. We went to the Sequoia Birthplace Museum every year. It's over in Fort Loudon, Tennessee. You can go there and watch recreations of early interactions between the Cherokee and colonial settlers. What makes him famous? Yeah.
Didn't you say that he created the Cherokee alphabet?
Good, the Cherokee alphabet. Very good. Now, the Treaty of Echota was the treaty that formally recognized the town of Cherokee's right to exist. And Echota is what they call the town of Cherokee.